A little bit. Okay, so welcome to the course on the interaction between architecture and neuroscience, with a particular emphasis on action. So we think of a building as a place in which we act, both physically, moving around, and aesthetically. And so in the next few lectures we're going to try and understand that better. Now this is a course given at the University of California at San Diego, and so part of the lecture will involve some interaction with the many students here in the classroom, but I'm hoping that this will nonetheless be a recording that will be of value to other people. So the idea is this, that if we look at the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, the main interest there, I think, is of architects trying to understand what lessons neuroscience might bring to the process of design. But I'm interested equally in what architecture can offer neuroscience, what we can get from the built environment that can offer new challenges. So today I'm going to give you both an overview of the course, and then I'm going to follow that by a discussion of action-oriented perception. And I was not looking at perception as a passive process, what do I see, but perception as an active process. How do I interact with the environment? And then that will lead into later lectures where we look at the design process, for example. Now, excuse me a moment while I just adjust the zoom. My apologies for the teething problems. Okay, so let me just start by talking about what is architecture. And some people will just say, well, it's the design of buildings, period. In a nice interview, Will Miller, whose father was instrumental in making Columbus, Indiana, a mecca for great architects, was interviewed and he made this interesting distinction between building, sculpture, and architecture. He said if it's a space that physically encloses a human activity and functions at a reasonable level, but has no capacity to elicit from you a desire to go further, think spiritually, worry about your fellow man, then it's just a building. And then on the other hand, he says, if it's an enormously elaborate, beautiful, moving space that you can inhabit, but it was designed as a symphony hall and you can't hear the orchestra in the back, then it's just a large-scale sculpture. So architecture for him, Will Miller, is that fantastic combination of the two, where it enhances and encloses human activity, but actually inspires you to do better. So part of the time we'll just be talking about buildings. And there are lots of very good, functional, and interesting buildings in the world, but occasionally we'll be reaching into the level of aesthetics and emotion and trying to understand what's happening there. So just one more quote from an architect. Is that Christopher Egan, an architect now deceased from San Antonio, talks about emotion and behavior in the architectural setting. So architecture moves us, it can comfort us or intimidate us, it can enlighten us or mystify us, it can bring joy or tear at our heart. So he's really getting into emotion, and in a later lecture we're going to come back and think about emotion more detail. Now the first one I have a little trouble with. Through primal space, it can touch our deepest emotional core, evoking shadow memories of the womb, the cave, the forest, and the light. Well, I'm not quite sure I remember the womb, but I think the idea is most people find watching a fire intriguing. They enjoy a beautiful sunset, a walk in the countryside. So there does seem to be some innate substrate for our aesthetic experience. And buildings can, in fact, evoke some of that. So that will be a theme we might or might not get back to. But certainly it recalls memories of culture. We can be in a different place in the world and learn different things from our expectations of what a pagoda or a mosque or a cathedral looks like. And then we can overlay our own building, our own experience, and our own expectations. If we walk into a bank, we may have a different expectation from walking into a school. So that's that side. Now, that's very crudely, and we'll be, of course, visiting it in much more detail. That's architecture. What about neuroscience? Well, these three elements sort of define a Venn diagram. So we're certainly interested in how people behave in buildings. We're interested in the experience that people have as they move through the building. And the general idea of looking at behavior and experience together is, I suppose, psychology. And then that becomes cognitive science when we worry about the underlying processes. And part of our discussion will be at that level. What's going on in our behavior, in our experience as we inhabit a building or design a building. But in other cases, we want to go down and bring in the brain. What are the processes that actually occur in different parts of the brain? How do they interact to give us this overall experience of the world? And for those of you who've been interested in phenomenology, phenomenology tries to look at the phenomena of people experiencing their world. So what we're saying is that sometimes that experience can be misleading. People may have brain damage or different experience, and so we want to understand what it is about their brains that may make that difference in experience of different people. So we can go deeper because we care about the neuroscience. So as a high-level view, including the Sydney Opera House and somebody with a brain, I have sort of come up with a threefold classification of the conversation between architecture and neuroscience. The base level is really neuroscience of the experience of architecture. What goes on as somebody moves through a building? What are they getting functionally? What are they getting aesthetically? But then that, of course, is in a loop with what's going on in the brain of the architect. In the design process, the idea is to in some sense anticipate, if you will, almost model the brains of the people who will be inhabiting the building and trying to get a sense of that. I will, in one lecture, add a new wrinkle that I call neuromorphic architecture, which is not what happens to the brain experiencing or designing a building, but what happens if the building had a brain. And now we've got so much technology coming into the home which has at least artificial intelligence in it. This suddenly has gone from a relatively academic idea to a very meaningful idea. But the question for us might be, does the brain matter there? In other words, is it the gadgets that matter to make a building smarter or more intelligent? Or are there lessons in thinking about an animal or a human moving around its world that can be turned into lessons for a building whose world is inside and looking at how it interacts with that interior world? So we'll get back to that much later in our discussion. So I just want to emphasize that we are here, this interaction between neuroscience and architecture, in the early days. We're not talking about a subject for which there's a great body of achievement. We're talking about a number of architects who've got interest in the brain, a number of neuroscientists who are wondering what new challenges they can get from looking at architecture. But if you go to the annual meeting of the Society for Neuroscience, they have about 15,000 items on the menu, talks, but mainly abstracts for posters. And I think last time I looked through, there are almost none of them addressing this specific topic. But there are some that address processes in the brain that I believe are relevant to our enterprise. So part of our challenge in this course will be to identify what are some of the things going on in neuroscience that we can bring to architecture, and then what does architecture say back in terms of, here are new studies you might conduct in neuroscience which are suitable for the lab rather than suitable for the assistant coming in and consulting on a particular building project. So that's just to give us a little bit of a reality check. Okay, before I get into the course mechanics, let me take you through an example. So you've all visited an art gallery, and so let's just think about some of the things that are involved in that visit. Well, first is you may decide you want to go to the exhibit of pre-Columbian art. And for that, you have to get directions, or you can just explore and come upon it at random. So you might engage in what we'll call wayfinding. And that's a little different depending on whether you know the building or whether you don't know the building. So we can get a whole set of already challenges about what sort of knowledge does one have to use if one already knows a complex environment like an art gallery versus if one is new to the gallery, and then what could the architect do to help those people, for example. Now, what about within a particular room? Now, the normal experience is you come into a room and most of the space in the center is empty. There might be a statue or two or a couple of display cases, but mainly you're going to have paintings or other things, exhibits around the wall. And so when you come into the room, maybe you'll turn and read what's on the wall, and then you'll start sort of at random, either going to the left or the right, and then following the wall until you've explored enough of the room. So these are the sort of expectations. But you're going to locate artworks, so maybe some artworks won't interest you, you'll walk by, others you'll stop, and you'll develop a strategy for viewing many of them. You're going to approach and choose a viewing point, you're going to contemplate the object, but meanwhile you're doing these things of avoiding obstacles, benches, other people, and choosing how to proceed. So all this poses challenges for the architect in coming up with the bones of the building, and the curator in coming up with the particular event. So we're not going to be responsible for designing a particular museum, but part of the work in this course is to get you to use your intuition. So you're not just saying, okay, tell me some neuroscience, I believe you, end of story. But as I think about real buildings, as I explore real buildings, or as I study real buildings, what has to be going on in my head if I were in that building? What has to be going in the head of if I were the architect thinking through that building? So let's look at one museum, and I've chosen this museum because it defies almost everything I've just told you about exploring a museum. So it's the work of Lina Bobardi, who was born in Italy but did most of her work in Brazil, and this is her art museum, the Sao Paulo Art Museum in Brazil. And so here we can see it. So from the outside already, it's very interesting. There's a very unconventional piece of architecture. It basically has the building, it's like a suspension bridge. The red frame suspends the building. So she's already getting very unconventional. This stuff behind her is not her building, that's other stuff. And let me show you, that's the picture I took. Let's look at a picture of somebody who was able to clear the traffic from the street. So let's look at our first job is, how do we get into the building? So standard for a building of this type and size is there's going to be a pretty magnificent entryway, and there's going to be a way of focusing your attention to get to that entryway. But in fact here, she went for the idea, here's a public space. It's not devoted to museum stuff, it's where the people can gather for meetings or demonstrations or whatever. And then you use some very general perceptual stuff to say, oh, there's a staircase there, there's a lift, an elevator there, and so depending on how athletic you are, you can choose one or the other to get in. So you're using this sort of knowledge, general knowledge, to say, well, I have to get up there, and there are just two ways to do it. And I pick one, and up I go. And I come in, and then, interestingly, Lina Bobardi had a very unusual idea about how to exhibit the art. And so for the first few years of the museum, they followed her method. Then they decided it was too radical and divided the space up rather conventionally. And then finally, they went back to an exhibition following her standards. And so here it is. Instead of an exhibition based on the walls on which you hang paintings, these concrete blocks are holding up a big sheet of glass on which each exhibit is placed, so that your affordances, as it were, your strategies for movement are totally different. Instead of following a wall to find works, you're standing in front of one exhibit, and then you look around, you catch glimpses of others, and based more perhaps on an aesthetic than a wall following criterion, you decide where to go next. The other strange feature is that the information is on the back. So you develop this totally different strategy of you get your attention caught, you look, and then you say, well, what is this? And maybe you go around the back, read the information, and then you come around again. Now, the point of doing this particular exhibit is just to make clear that in architecture, you both build on conventions and you destroy conventions. And so, in the first instance, getting into the place, she's destroying one convention, namely magnificent entryway for an important building. But on the other hand, she's saying, I've got to let you see there are stairs or elevators so you get into the place. And then you come into the exhibit hall and you have this totally different way of displaying things. So that's the first round. Now, this raises a number of issues, some of which I've already said, and going through these issues will be much of our discussion today in week one. Things like the action-perception cycle. We're not looking at perception in terms of just, if we were just talking about standing in front of the painting and forming an impression of it, you might think of perception, in this case visual perception, as the totality of what's involved. But the scenario I've given you in the art gallery is action and perception are integrated. And it's not just visual, right? As you move around, you're hearing the conversations, you're feeling the floor, and things of this kind. So it's multisensory integration of action and perception. Affordance and effectivities. Affordance is a term that goes back to the Cornell psychologist J.J. Gibson, and it's basically looking at vision in terms of what can you pull out of a visual scene that will determine your course of action. And then effectivities, later disciples came up with this term as the other side, the notion that, well, you have to be capable of the actions for there to be affordances for them. So as you develop, you're both increasing your ability to detect affordances for action, but you're also increasing the repertoires of actions that you can deploy because you can perceive those affordances. I'm going to talk briefly about a general framework of perceptual and motor schemas. I put scripts in parentheses because I'm not talking about them, but this is the idea that in different situations, going to a bank, going to a birthday party, going to a restaurant, it's not just the individual bits of sensory stimulation that allow you to guide the perception to choose the action. You have a whole generalized script of what goes on in a restaurant or what goes on in an art gallery. And we saw what was interesting perhaps about Lino Bobardi's exhibit was part of the script we kept. I'm going to go from painting to painting and decide which ones I admire and form my opinions of them. But other parts of the script, if I come into a room and there are walls that I can follow, she disengaged herself from. So that leads into this topic of wayfinding. And here we come to this idea of forming a map of the world. And in this particular case, we probably need to find our way around a new museum, spatial layout, but also language. So the interaction of our basic sensory motor integration with capability for language is another topic that we will come back to, but not today. So here, in fact, are the week-by-week topics, and I reserve the right to change this because as I interact with the students, it may be that we'll find that some topics need to be developed more deeply, or some are not as well attuned to their interests. So here we are just today, an action-oriented perspective on space and cognitive maps. Then I'm going to use the Sydney Opera House in particular to ground a discussion of architectural design. I'm going to be in Santiago in Chile on week 3, so we won't meet then, but for those of you watching the videos, that won't matter. Week 4, atmosphere as another kind of affordance. So the notion is that for Gibson, it's sort of the English language supports something of a pun, I suppose, that Gibsonian affordances are affordance for motion, and atmosphere is affordances for emotion. So that as you experience a building, you're both saying, oh, this is a beautiful building, or I don't feel safe in this neighborhood, or things of that kind. And these are affordances for emotion rather than the affordances for motion that we emphasize with Gibson. Mirror neurons, I had a collaboration going with Giacomo Rizzolatti and various other colleagues back in around 1990, and so we were part of the team that they discovered the mirror neurons. My group came up with the first computational model of mirror neurons, and since then I've done a lot of work on thinking about the relation between mirror neurons and human evolution, and I'll get to that possibly in lecture 7, from hand to symbol, brain, language, and architecture. But in 5, we're talking about mirror neurons in relation to mirroring the emotional state of others, and discuss to what extent those mechanisms that allow us to mirror the emotional state of others also allow us to mirror, in some sense, the atmosphere created by buildings. And I'm going to be somewhat critical of some views on that, but I think that may be useful. And then, before we continue with the mirror neuron story in relation to language, I'll interpose a discussion of that notion of neuromorphic architecture, to what extent the notion of smart architecture that's become well established in the last few years might be enlivened by thinking about if the building had a brain, in the sense, as I say, of an animal has a brain to manage the world outside it, maybe a building will have a brain to manage the world inside it. To what extent are there basic, if you will, brain operation principles that might be relevant there? Then, from hand to symbol, if in this thing I say, well, how does language come in and then how does language go back? Here, the issue is drawing as another representation, a very crucial representation for architecture. What is that sketch doing? And how did we get that ability to represent the world that way? To what extent are drawing and language cousins of each other? What do they share in brain mechanisms? What are they distinctive? What does that mean for the practice of architecture? The big controversy among many architects now is those who say, unless I sketch something, I'm missing out on a good design, and others who say, well, I am so fluent on the computer, I'm much better doing my design right on the computer. And of course, there are other things like making physical models and so on. So, tentatively, I plan to come back to design and creativity in week 9, but it may turn out to be better to interpose it earlier on. But the students will be making their final presentations at the last lecture. That won't be taped, unless they ask, in which case you will get to see what they've done. So the general format for the meetings is that the first half, after this initial meeting, will be student presentations on the work they've done in the previous week, based on, and then the second half will be a new lecture that I'll give, and the idea is that the lecture forms the basis to allow the students to explore in more depth in the following week than they could have without already having a set of signposts around. So I will not record this half, and the videos will just cover the second half. So this is for the students in the room, but I think I've included here because I think it may be useful for those of you viewing these tapes in terms of setting up your own course in this subject. So we're meeting at 8:30 in the morning, so if you can email your assignments to me a little earlier. There's a Word file as the core requirement each week, with a few exceptions, but the discussion can either be that you just want to talk about it around the table, or you may want to show some slides to illustrate. So if you're going to show slides, okay, send them in so we have them. So I'm suggesting not too big a job, but maybe 3 pages, and a bibliography. And the idea of the bibliography is I want you to explore for yourself to complement the readings I suggest. And in particular, I say 2 and 2, 2 neuroscience, 2 architecture, but if you want to do more, that's fine. Or if you want to 1 week really push into the neuroscience and another week really push into the architecture, that's fine. What I want for the references is your expansion. So it's not just here's the formal citation, but include the published abstract and then show me that you've thought about it more than just reading the abstract. What's your critical assessment? What's its relevance? NfA is sort of the abbreviation, Neuroscience for Architecture. What's your critical assessment? Which may mean, critical may mean, here's why I really think it's relevant and important for us, or here's why I think it's crap. But nonetheless, it's worth criticizing because we learn a lot, I think, both from stuff we read that just simply tells us neat stuff that we want to add to our repertoire, but also from developing our critical apparatus so that we can read something and say, okay, well, maybe this is good, but this part of it is not. And this is why I reject it. And by articulating that, we are making progress in our understanding. So that's the basic story. And then let me just tell you about the first 2 assignments, and then I think after that we can get into the real meat of the lecture. So the first assignment is, because this is a class in a psychology department that is attracting people interested in neuroscience and cognitive science, the notion is you've all experienced buildings, but have the people in this class thought about it critically? So some of the people who will look at the videos will be hopefully experienced architects. But even then, some of these questions may be useful to them. So the idea is, in this case, choose a local building for this first assignment. A building you can go to, walk around, take photos. And I've already said part of it is more than vision is involved. So what's the building there for? What are the affordances of the building? You know, what's access to the building? How can you find your way around the building? What's the atmosphere? That's our word for those emotional overtones. Is this a building that makes you feel good, or makes you feel oppressed, or makes you feel lost? And I guess aesthetics is sort of another aspect of that. And maybe as you annotate what's going on as you experience the building, you can also be beginning to form some sort of critical assessment for the experience of the building atmospherically or aesthetically. What might have made it more attractive? For the use of the building, what might have made it a more useful building? Interesting thing about affordances, I was discussing with one of the architects here on campus the design of the new college, and we got into the theory of nudges. The nudge basically is people have options. Maybe one option is better for them than another. How do you construct a situation so that they'll make the better choice? So the classic example is that people are employed, they have an option to get a retirement, put funds into retirement. And so the nudge is, the choice you have to make is to opt out of retirement, because people put off making those decisions. So this way, more people will get retirement funding than won't. So that's an example of a nudge. So the example of the nudge we were discussing for one of the new buildings is you come in the door and you have the stairs leading up right in front of you and the elevator's round to the side. So that nudge, by giving you an affordance, that sort of the strong affordances for stairs, the tough affordance, if you will, is for the elevator. You're encouraged to the exercise of at least going up to, let's say, the floor on which the cafeteria is. So these are some of the things that you can think about. What is the placement and style of the entryways, grand entry versus diverse doors? What are cues are available for wayfinding? How do you read them? What about others? So I want to stress that this is, you're just going to come up with maybe 2 or 3 pages of text plus some photos to illustrate it, and then you're going to go off and see if you can find any papers in neuroscience that strike you as even mildly relevant. So this is not something to be intimidated by. It's to be just simply to get you engaging in the conversation that this course is designed to support. Okay. And then finally, before we get into the good stuff, let me talk about assignment 2, because this is the preliminary proposal for the course project. So we'll talk about this more next week in setting you up for it. And you'll have 2 weeks to work on this because I'll be away in week 3. So the lecture next week will be how do we link cognitive neuroscience and architectural design. I'm going to use the Swiss architect Peter Zumthor and the Danish architect Jørgen Utzon to look at some of the sort of effort that might be involved. And so your final project, due in the last week, will be to offer your own paper but focused on the design of another famous building. And I'll be coming back next week as part of the presentation or maybe part of the discussion before we go into the video of some possible sources. So you might want to think about what, if there's a famous building you love, and we can talk about that in the discussion part before we go to video, or I can bring in some things that you might want to consider as examples. But as I say, don't be intimidated. I'm looking for a preliminary document that's more designed to get feedback. And then with that feedback that you'll get in week 4, then that'll help you for the next 6 weeks do a better job than if you were just told to come back at the end. So the first one, as I say, is find a building that interests you and which is, and this is the crucial part, it's famous enough that its design has been documented in the literature. So for Utzon, I've been able to access a lot of books and people, and then give us enough detail about your reading to demonstrate that it provides hooks to link these design features to challenges in cognitive neuroscience. So I mean, my job a week from now is to convince you that I found a few hooks with respect to Utzon and Zumthor, and again, you may find those not very good, so I'll be the live audience can jump in and critique and ask questions as we go along. But hopefully that will give you a sense that then you, in the following 2 weeks, can go. And I will put together a guide to some possible resources that I'll discuss with the live class before we go to video. And then, in the spirit of each week, I want you to get deeper into the neuroscience literature to come back with maybe a couple of papers on affordances, a couple of papers on the body schema, or whatever, but papers that enrich our brief discussion of people interacting with buildings. What are specific issues in neuroscience that might help us go more deeply into that? Because the crucial aim is to work with the students in this class to really amass, I think, a good set of papers that really can contribute to this conversation, papers that can be the basis for discussions between neuroscience and architects, where for the architects it's, well, how do I turn that into something useful to my practice? And for the neurosciences, okay, this is great, but how would I turn that into something I could really do research on? Okay, so before I start on the next part, any questions from the room? Okay, we can talk more about this after the class is over and take it from there. But anyway, so we've set ourselves up for this. We're going to talk of an action-oriented perspective on space for the rest of our meeting today. And this is the courtyard of the Salk Institute, which is just across the road from UCSD. It was designed by Louis Kahn, so his building would be one of the candidates for either for your local building to explore, perhaps, and maybe find another one for more detailed study. There is not a brain normally visible from here, although there's a lot of research on neuroscience at the Salk. But every 2 years, in September, we have the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture holds an international meeting, and it's carefully timed so that the sun sets right here behind the fountain. And so the program actually includes sunset. and we have to arrange around because apparently we haven't been able to fix the time, so we have to go with whatever time nature provides. Okay, so let me just give you some readings. For those of you here, these are already available on the blackboard, along with today's version of the syllabus. So there are two things I'd really like you to read, and then there are other things that you might use to anchor your own exploration of the literature. So the two required things are a paper I gave in Singapore, When Brains Design Experience Buildings. It's somewhat tuned to a particular theme on the idea of a good life, whatever that is, that the organizers came up with. But it really is, in some sense, one of my quick overviews of the themes that we'll be going into in much more detail in the course. So that's a good reference. And then the other is, there was a meeting held in Chicago just a few months ago, funded by the Driehaus Foundation, and one of the speakers there was Bob Hart, Robert Lamb Hart, who's an architect. He's retired now, but developed one of the big firms in San Francisco. And so he talked on the theme of architecture as experience, human perception in the built environment. And this is, in a sense, coming from the other end. Here's an architect talking about what he feels architects need to know about perception and their perspective on architecture as experience. So I think reading that this will help you begin to think more about some of the goalposts for the architecture neuroscience linkage. There's no neuroscience in here, but there is a posing of problems by an architect, of wishes, of desires by an architect that really engage a lot of what we'll be talking about. So these two will give you this out. Now, these are the optional readings. Ballasmar's book, Juhani Ballasmar is probably the leading thinker about architecture in Europe. He's also a distinguished architect in his own right. He's from Helsinki in Finland, and he has several books which I recommend, but let's start here. The Eyes of the Skin, Architecture and the Senses, and he's rebelling against the idea of thinking of architecture in terms of those glossy pictures in the architecture magazines as being what architecture is. Sure, that visual appearance, that aesthetic appearance is important, but there's so much more. So the eyes of the skin is that idea of touch, hearing, and all these other things complement it. So this I haven't made available to you. You can either try and get it from the library, or in these days of instant gratification, you can buy a used copy from Amazon and have your own copy as part of your own library. But now these four ones here take us into particular dimensions of neuroscience. So they're an example of reviewish articles that, well, here's another book. This is Robert Lamb Hart's book on which this talk was based. So these three other ones. Tom Albright is a visual neuroscientist across the road at the Salk Institute. So this is a good review paper that he wrote, The Perception of Probable Things, a few years ago. Carol Colby, this is a classic paper. Carol is the university, I think, at in Carnegie Mellon or Pitt. And this is action-oriented spatial reference frames in cortex. I have a slide which I'll briefly mention this later, but the notion is that our consciousness gives us the illusion, well, not the illusion, but we feel we are having a unified experience of the world around us. Now, one of the counterexamples to that we know is that our retina only has a very narrow fovea, about 2 degrees of vision, so that what we see here is in fact the integration of all these peripheral sketches and these foveal details that we very quickly build up our impression that we actually are seeing this whole environment. But at any time, this is how much we're seeing in detail. But the other thing is that there are many different action-oriented spatial reference frames. So you start with the reference frame of what's on the retina, but then you have to translate it into how do I shake my hand? How do I move my eyes? How do I move my arm? How do I locomote? So that, starting from vision is, I think, Carol's main interest, but starting from any other thing. How do we integrate the sound and the and the vision, so that if I hear a sound, I know where to look. A classic study with frogs from Moscow was that you take a frog, you put some irritant on its arm, and the frog, with only the spinal cord alone, is able to wipe the frog. Now that's interesting, because the arm you could have put here, in which case the wipe of that irritant would be here, or you could have the arm over here, in which case the wipe is in this way. So the frog's spinal cord alone is enough to make a map of the disposition of the body schema. So I'll come back to that, although we won't talk about that specific paper. And then finally, a space in the brain, how the hippocampal formation supports spatial cognition. A few years back, I was going to London to give a talk, and I wrote to John O'Keefe to say, oh, John, I'm going to be in London on this date. Could we get together? And he wrote back and said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to be out of the country, Michael. And then after I got that, it suddenly hit me, oh, that's the day he's getting his Nobel Prize. So what a modest guy, not to tell me the reason he'd be out of the country. Anyway, John O'Keefe and his colleagues are part of the real core, Nobel Prize worthy, of studying the hippocampus and its role in spatial cognition. So these three papers are examples of the sort of thing that can be relatively accessible. They're not the primary research, but they're written by people who do primary research, but trying to write. Now they're writing for a neuroscience audience rather than an architecture audience, but finding papers like that, I think, will help you begin to build up that set of papers that are a knowledge base for what is the neuroscience we can tell the architects about, what are the papers that can anchor our search of what's going on in buildings that we can bring back through this medium of the review papers down to the level of the primary research for what might be done to increase that knowledge base. So it's that sort of communication that I hope you can find, maybe some review papers, some primary papers that strike you as important. And I'll be here for the students in the class to aid in that search as requested. So, I've emphasized the idea that we're going to be thinking about people moving through buildings or moving around buildings or doing things inside buildings. So the whole point is we want to think about not just perception, how do we see the building, and not just multisensory perception, how do we see, feel, touch, smell, taste the building, but action. And so this classic diagram, what we call the action-perception cycle, goes back to Ulrich Neisser, a cognitive psychologist from Cornell. And what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, out there is the world. But at any time, there's only a small sample, a small part of it that we could possibly sample. And so we make a sample of the world. We see something, we hear something. We get those sensory data, and now those come in. And the idea is that at any time we have built up what he'll call a cognitive map, but it's in a more general sense, we have knowledge of the world. And then the knowledge of the world combined with the current sample of sensory information lets us update, if you will, the schema. I would prefer schema assemblage of the present environment. What is it we know about the here and now based on what we know in the long term? And of course, these can inform each other because as we have new experience, we can update our long-term knowledge of the world. And then on that basis, we can choose to act. And that action can either be locomotion, another action that changes the world, or it can be perceptual exploration. I can look around, I can shift my attention, I can move to see something more closely, or I can move to interact with something or some person. And so the point is that as we move, we change what part of the environment we're sampling. We change that in maybe two different ways. By physical or social interaction, we may change the state of the world. The world itself may be changing, but also where we're directing our attention will change what our sample will be. And so it's that whole cycle that really is the framework for all our discussion. Okay? So, I've mentioned several times the name J.J. Gibson and the notion of affordances, and affordances, I will say, is if I look here, if you think of vision in terms of what do I see in the world, what can I name in the world, very striking here, this yellow contrast grabs our attention, and we're very likely to saccade here, and then having saccaded here, we can recognize this is a woman wearing a yellow dress with a handbag over her shoulder, and we can go on in that phase of description, but there's no action potential there. She's not somebody I know. She's just one person in a crowd. So although I may note those aspects, I'm walking down the street, let's say going to a particular bar or to get to the metro station. Now, as I go, one affordance is that at, sort of at the conscious level, I may be seeing, okay, I have to move to the left or the right to avoid hitting this person. But Gibson also noticed there are unconscious things, like optic flow. So the idea is that as I move, the world projects onto my retina, so there is a flow of features across the retina. And it turns out that people following J.J. Gibson, like David Lee in Edinburgh and others, have shown that from this you can get information about time until contact. So you're moving along, and there may be something in your periphery that you're not even conscious of, but it sends a signal saying, hey, there's going to be a collision in a couple of seconds in that direction, and you change direction without even conscious thought because of that affordance offered by the optic flow. And it may be you'll later get an indignant phone call from a friend who says, hey, why did you stun me? Because it was them that you were avoiding, but it's not that you were snubbing them, you just had no conscious awareness. So, and then I've already mentioned to you this complementary notion of effectivities, because affordances are related to what it is we can do. So what is an affordance for locomotion? What is an affordance for locomotion is different from an affordance for, let's say, flight. So, I mean, actually literally flying. If I were a bird, I might lift up to go over the head of the person, but as a human, I have to keep walking around. So that's a very crucial notion. And so, actually, we've done two things here, right? Because we've both talked about affordance in terms of what sort of visual cues can guide our immediate action, but we've also talked about attention and the idea that in this case it's what we call bottom-up attention. I didn't intend to look at this woman, but somehow if you look at that scene, you almost can't avoid. If I were charting your eye movements, probably there would be very quick and bang, it would be there. So there's this sort of bottom-up salience that certain things pop out of the image and grab our attention. Whereas there are other things that we require a search. If I say, where is the owl? I think that's an owl, but it would take you a little while to find it. So that notion of affordances, on the one hand, thinking of them, they can either be automatic, or they can, like the optic flow, or they can require, if I say, meet me at the metro, then maybe this M will catch you, and then you'll have to read the sign to see how you get from there to the metro station. So the issue for us is, what does that mean in terms of our analysis of the building or the environment, and what does that suggest? So movement is the measure of space. So the idea is that for the scientist, maybe using a Cartesian measurement system of X, Y, and Z is useful to define points in the world. But for animals, and for most of the time as humans, what makes space matter to us is the actions that are available to us. So, and then I already mentioned Carol Colby's article on action-oriented spatial reference frames, and just that we can go into different parts of the brain and we can measure correlates of oculomotor space. Where is the information that lets us turn our eyes to a target? Where are the representations that we can use when walking around? Where are the representations that guide the way we reach? Where are the representations that shape our hand? in anticipation of the object we're reaching, and many more. And what's interesting then is that our conscious experience, as I said, is of a unified world, but in fact our brain has all these multiple representations. And so these gain their coherence unless we have brain damage, not because of a mathematical definition of space in the abstract, but because there is a repertoire of actions. We normally coordinate them. I see an object, I want to pick it up. So for my action to succeed, my estimate of where the object is in my locomotor space, so that I can get it to where it is in my grasping space, in my reaching space, so that I can then shake my hand to successfully pick it up. It's the fact that they have become tuned so that for a whole range of actions they work together. And this is a tangent, but one of the studies we did modeling with relation to Tom Thatcher's group at Washington University in St. Louis was what happens when you put prisms on that shift the visual field. And the fascinating discovery was that you need the cerebellum to make the shift, but the cerebellum doesn't shift the visual field. It shifts the visual data for different actions. So a person can have been wearing these prisms and have learned how to compensate for an overarm throw and yet still throw off target for an underarm throw. So there's privacy of sensory motor transformations. But you have your brain can find the information you need for whatever it is you have to do. That's the basic idea. Okay. So now I want to introduce this general notion of schemas. Many people have used the term. Perhaps in psychology, the most famous one is Frederick Bartlett, who talked about remembering and the idea that memory is not so much you remember in total detail what happened, but rather you encode it in terms of schemas, and there may be some information. And the big example of that is I don't know what people call it, I think the telephone game. You have a table and you tell a little story at the beginning, and each person tells it to the next person, and then the last person tells the story, and the first person bursts into helpless laughter because each recoding has been respectful for much of the story they heard, but has changed some element. So and then Piaget talks about schemas in terms of the mental development of the child. My version is based on thinking about the way we have to construct our world from multiple cues and the different processes involved. So they're the basic units from which complex actions can be constructed. Each schema embodies the knowledge of how to act or perceive, and we have to integrate patterns of perception, perceptual schemas, with patterns for action, motor schemas. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. But just to say a little bit more, perceptual schemas are how do we recognize what's going on? And the notion is that when I perceive something, as we've already said, that perception may be more descriptive. Like I recognize that lady in the yellow dress, there's no implication for action in that particular case. I just note certain relationships about her, certain things about her. I'm not sure if you showed that photo to me again and it changed the face of the woman, I would have noticed that change. On the other hand, if she were wearing a green dress, I'd certainly be aware. And if she wasn't wearing the bag, I'd be aware. But maybe if the bag had changed shoulders, I wouldn't be, etc., etc. So, but in general, I'm concerned with not simply perceiving something as such, but what possible actions can follow from that. Although I'm going to give you both an example of perceptual schemas for action and perceptual schemas more for just recognizing, analyzing a scene. And then the idea is that I'm interested in the schema assemblage. So if you think about deep learning, which is the big fashion, the idea is I give you a whole scene and I grok the whole scene on my computer and out comes a standard description. But if things are away from the normal, that method has no way of identifying the aberrations and constructing the scene from different pieces. So in general, I need different pieces to be assembled. And then similarly, motor schemas in general, they're the units of a plan, but if I'm going to reach and grasp something, I have to have at least a motor schema for moving my arm and a separate motor schema for shaping my hand, and they have to be coordinated. So I use the term coordinated control program for that. So that's going to be the first example I'm going to use. This, the data that inspired me were from Marc Généreux, who was a great neuropsychologist in Lyon in France, and his Algerian, I think, postdoc Jean Beguer, and they were studying just humans moving to grasp objects. And so this is just taking photographs and looking at different frames, superimposing them. And the crucial point here is that as the arm moves, it's moving the hand to get to the position where the grasp is possible. There seems to be a safety factor. If you try to move straight, two things are wrong. Probably you keep bumping into the table, and secondly, it would be very hard to grasp from that angle. So in some sense, you're planning to come in at an angle which will allow you to grasp the ball, and then you're coming up with the arm controller has to come up with the trajectory that will yield this, and meanwhile the hand controller is beginning to shape the hand so it will arrive with a little safety margin so that you can then close in and complete the grasp. And so the framework I came up for this goes like this, that here at the minimum you have to recognize the location of the object, its size and its orientation. The location can direct the hand to move fast to get close and then slow down for that feedback adjustment as you grasp. So you have a fast phase movement and a slow phase movement. During the fast phase movement, the hand is shaped and rotated, and then the transition from fast to slow coincides with the initiation of that enclosure for the actual grasp. And so this provides a framework in which a lot of work in motor control has proceeded. But my point at this stage of our discussion is simply to make the point about the intimate interaction between perceptual schemas and motor schemas. The brain has to be able to analyze the world to extract different parameters. Where is the target? What is the size of the target? What is the orientation of the target? And different processes may grab different aspects. And so depending upon, yes?
Does this have any hierarchy in it? I can't tell just from looking at it immediately, but...
is there any hierarchy? Well, yes, in the sense that this is a two-level analysis of the hand reaching. We're saying it has to have a sub-schema for getting you close and a sub-schema for adjusting where the hand is at the end. And then this has three sub-schemas, so it's again 2 levels. And so if you put these together, you've got at least 3 levels. You've got the motor schema of 2 levels, the motor schema of 2 levels. I guess you can call this the perceptual analysis. Has 3 components. Those 3 components feed these two-level motor schemas. So yes, in general, and then the hierarchy can continue. And this would be an example of a hierarchy for a very standard movement. This is a very highly skilled movement, as distinct from when you're in a novel situation and then you may have to combine different elements to succeed in the task. Yeah. All right, now I'm going to move on to a model of pure visual perception, if you will. Do any of you recognize this particular? Okay, it's a guy named Magritte, René Magritte, a Belgian surrealist artist, and this is the top half of a picture of his. So what is the picture?
Castle.
It's a castle on top of a mountain, right? Yeah. Okay, now let's look at the rest of the picture. So the top half is locally realistic, right? Castle on top of the mountain. The bottom half, maybe it's a little strange, but it's a massive boulder falling into the sea. Put the two together, it's totally unrealistic. So the realism and surrealism is the complete picture. The local realism is battling global constraints. In this end, it's not that your knowledge is forced to say, here is the interpretation. In this case, you have to settle for the paradox. And that's his art in that case, is to let you sort of be very sure of what you're seeing locally and yet totally confused globally. But the point I'm making about this is that visual perception is not a matter of binary computation. It's a matter of what I'll call competition and cooperation. You've got different local hypotheses, perhaps subconscious, about what is going on in different parts of the image. And those that are coherent will cooperate and work together. But in some cases, the local detail will overwhelm you, and you end up with you can't find global coherence. In other cases, of course, you look at a scene and you make global sense of it. So let me just very briefly introduce you to some work my colleagues did, it's frightening, 40 years ago at the University of Massachusetts, but I still think conceptually it's one of the best accounts. And the slogan I'm using here, which we'll come back to next week, is even perception involves construction. So if you just look at that very quickly, you say, okay, it looks like a house with maybe a guy in front of it, end of story. But to analyze it is much harder. So the two-level analysis that they employed, and if you're interested I can send you more details, is firstly of competition and cooperation at the level of local image features. Another Nobel Prize was for the work of Hubel and Wiesel at Harvard on visual cortex. And what they showed was that if you look at a cell in cat and later in monkey cortex, the cells in V1, in the primary visual cortex, are responsive to oriented edges. And so the issue that many of us from a computational point of view asked was, well, how do you integrate that information? So I see an edge here, but if a cell sort of seems to prefer that edge and it's firing, if it's not firing at its peak, is that because it's a blurred edge at the right angle or a slightly different edge but nearby, for example? So you've got many cells firing, and so the idea is that here we see the result of algorithms based partly on the Hubel-Wiesel idea. If I have local information about edges, how do I integrate them to come up with what I think are good estimates for contours in the image? And the other thing that's going on here is that you can use color and texture to sort of say, well, there's continuity, there's variation here, but there's continuity in the color or the texture. And so I can sort of grow out a region and I can delimit a region. And so those can cooperate. Now, there are some problems with this. Notice that a crucial edge is missing here. And note that there are some strange edges, because a highlight or a shadow might fool the low-level process that doesn't yet know anything about the world. And so what happens is this provides the first pass for the world, for the visual brain, to begin to say, okay, there are some things I can recognize. There are, it might say, okay, well, at the top of the image, there's a region that has the right sort of color, and it's the right extent for my best bet to be sky. And then this region here, it has a similar color. It's pretty big, but it's lower in the image. And so it might have where this might be 0.9 for sky, this might have a 0.2 confidence score for sky. But now context begins to work, because it says, okay, you've got sky above you, you've got this shape, which I know to be a typical roof shape, and so I'm going to bet that you're a roof. So you might get a 0.6 for this being a roof, but now, if it's a roof, then again, all this is unconsciously going on in the brain or going on in your computational model. But then this will say, well, if I'm a roof, unless you're in some of these terrible disaster scenes we've been saying lately, there should be a house underneath it, and I should be able to detect windows or shutters or whatever. And so as I examine this region and begin to find these things, I begin to say, oh, here are the shutters, the windows, so this increases my confidence score here, and I begin to be pretty sure that this region is a wall of a house. And then I get into problems because, oh, this is missing. But now that just directs my attention to can I find a boundary I missed on the first pass that will let me see the difference? And so once I find that boundary that is in the original image but not very clear, I'm set. And I can say, oh, well, this top part must be the sky, this bottom part must be the wall. And then the one last question before we abandon the slide and look at the next one, which makes the points I've just been making more vivid, is that you could say, well, why didn't you just lower the threshold? Why didn't you make it easier to find edges? Because then you wouldn't have missed that edge. And the answer is, but then I would have had so many little patches of shadow and little patches of highlight, etc., it would have been impossible to find any regions that I could reliably make a first pass on. So that's the sort of idea. And okay, before I do part 2 of the previous slide, the vision system, I just want to mention this nice slide. Around 1961, when I was a graduate student at MIT, I met Horace Barlow, who was, I think he's still alive, who was the leading figure probably in visual neuroscience in England at the time. And he was telling me about the work of Hubel and Wiesel, and he explained this stuff to me. He said, well, Mike, you see, because of this extraction of outlines, that's why you can recognize caricatures. This is Hitchcock, for those of you old enough to remember. But anyway, so then I asked him the crucial question. I said, but Horace, or Dr. Barlow, I can't remember how respectful I was at that age, but Horace, how come I can tell you're not a caricature? And so this goes back to the question we discussed a little while ago about hierarchy. This is a different hierarchy, but here's the idea: you've got these edge detectors, and then you begin to build up towards higher level descriptions. But the notion is that finding the contour, finding a characteristic contour, doesn't mean you throw away the other levels. So all this information about texture and shading and color is part of that final percept. So this again is one of these puzzles about the brain, is that we really have this unitary consciousness, and yet we can only achieve that recognition of the face of a scholar looking at us over his unbuttoned shirt and wearing glasses, because we can integrate all those levels. So the caricature was an important part of getting us there, and it can serve as a recognition cue if we meet it in a cartoon, but it's not the totality of our visual experience. So anyway, just to finish that particular computer system I was talking about, here is the final interpretation that very primitive system of 40 years ago could get to, but it was able to correctly recognize foliage versus grass or grass. It was able to recognize the roof. It was able to recognize the shutters and the walls pretty well. And the point of that is not to say, why didn't it do better? The point, I think, is to say, this seems to me at least to demonstrate key principles of the way the brain works, that you're taking diverse cues and you're integrating them to create experiences. In this case, it's a purely visual experience. And then the Horace Barlow picture was to say that, of course, this isn't just labeling, our experience is much richer, as we can, in seeing Horace, if you know him to recognize him, or seeing a house with a guy in front of it and so on, your recognition, my claim is driven by the sort of processes I've talked here, but all those different levels are integrated with that fine detail of the low-level features to give you the rich visual experience. And then our question is, if we're thinking about architecture, on the one hand, what do I do to create a rich visual experience as an architect? On the other hand, what do I do to create an experience for the action perception cycle so the person can move and interact with, work within that building? So that's sort of setting that up. Okay, now this is just a brief addendum. These few slides could be expanded into 1 or 2 lectures in themselves, but this is a classic Russian painting, and I'm going to use it to remind you or tell you about a classic eye movement study conducted by a Russian psychologist. So this painting is by Ilya Ryepin, and it's called "He Was Not Expected." And even in the days when Ryepin was painting under the Tsar rather than under the communist regime, there were concentration camps. And here is a guy who's just suddenly come home, totally unexpected. They'd lost him to the camps. He came home. And so you've got all these, here is the servant, here's perhaps his mother, the kids and so on, and we have all these different things going on. Now what Jarbas did was he showed people this painting and he tracked their eye movements, but the crucial thing was that when he tracked the eye movements, so maybe I think, you know, if we go back to our woman in the yellow dress, then I think the composition sort of, you focus on this guy first if you're just looking at the painting without any particular instructions. Then you may begin, perhaps in a rather idiosyncratic way, to shift your attention. And there are some studies. A colleague at USC, Laurent Ity, had his PhD thesis on what are the bottom-up cues. What can you take from contrast of color or in more general stages, movement and so on, that will direct your attention so that you look at something and then you look at the second most salient thing and the third most salient thing, and you can discuss that. What Jarbas's work, writing in '67, did was he just asked people to look at the scene, but for different things. So free examination. So this is the eye movements, and as I suggested, the sort of center of attention, the place you spend more time, is looking at this guy, and he's the reference frame from which you explore the rest of the image. Estimate the material circumstances of the family, give ages of the people. Okay, now notice here, you very quickly find out where the faces are, and now the eye movements are exploring the faces. Remember the clothes worn by the people. Okay, so now you've got those same people, but now you're moving up and down to look at the clothing rather than to focus on the faces. So the point here is, I have no idea what this means. Estimate how long the unexpected visitor has been away from the family. I think that's probably just thrown in there as a nonsense question, since I at least can't get it from there, except, hey, it's been a while. But the point of this is that normally in your perception, there is this interaction between the bottom-up cues, just that the scene draws your attention to different things, and the top-down cues. You always have certain expectations. But within that action perception cycle again, here the action is cued by the particular instruction of the experimentalist. More generally, as we saw in the NICER, NEISSER action perception cycle, you're working within that range of things. So this may seem a little strange, but especially since the figure is missing. So this issue of what is the linkage between action and perception, for me, actually goes way back to a classic study called What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. This was a group at MIT, McCulloch, Pitts, Letfin, and Maturana, who were placing electrodes in the retina and the tectum of a frog, and finding that the signals coming back were both retinotopic, in other words, they formed a spatial arrays in register with the retina, but also there were 4 different types of response, and one of them was for large moving objects, as if detecting a predator flying overhead, and the other was for small moving objects, as if detecting prey. And so I went on to wonder about what does the frog's eye tell the frog. So anyway, here we have the idea that the frog, for prey, as exemplified by this poor fly, first produces orienting, followed by approach if sufficiently far, then snapping when within striking distance. So we've got here the perceptual schema, as can I detect in this case, it's not very clever, but because basically you can fool it with almost any small moving object. But a small moving object, it has to convert that into a three-dimensional recognition of, does it have to turn, does it have to hop forward, and then how does it project its tongue to hit. So we already see here my first example of the linkage of perception and action. And the second one was a predator. And what's interesting here is that where for the prey, the motor action is, as it were, in register with the retina, for a predator, you'd better make a different direction, because you want to get away from the predator, not towards it. So this was just a first example, and mating is another example And the interest here is simply that depending on the time of year, the hormonal level will determine whether the male frog is more into prey or mates for its behavior. But this is going to get back to architecture in a rather surprising way in a moment. In a model with a PhD student named Don House, now at Texas A&M, we explained frog behavior by coming up with these potential fields. And so the idea here is that the gall, the worms, creates an attractive field. So if nothing else were there, the perception of the worm would set up this field of attraction, and the frog would come up with a trajectory straight towards it. But the fence creates a repulsion, a repulsive field, which is much more local. In other words, you go a long way to get to food, but a fence doesn't matter unless you're close. So you've got this repulsion in front and behind. But now if you integrate these two fields, then the frog comes up with a trajectory that will carry it around to get there. So this notion that, in our hands, this notion of combining attraction and repulsion to control behavior in the external world was very important. And it turns out, intriguingly, that it is also coming to the realm of aesthetics. So here's a book that wasn't on my list for today's reading, but is one you might want to get out of the library or buy for yourself. The Dynamics of Architectural Form by Rudolf Arnheim. Now, Arnheim was a very distinguished art critic, and so he had a previous volume on basically visual perception and art. And so here he tried to see, what can I carry over, what do I have to do new when I look at architectural form. So it's a non-action oriented view, but you can ignore the two comments there. But here is the example I want to show you. Now, strangely, in the book, this is the figure that accompanies the text, but I think it's the wrong figure, and this is the figure that should have gone with it. And do you know Le Corbusier? Okay, so one of the greatest architects of the 20th century, he flourished in the, well, I don't know the exact date, but I think from the 20s to the 60s. He was head of the committee that designed the United Nations. But look up his name. Lots of good stuff. By the way, in terms of your preparation of assignments, Wikipedia these days is just phenomenal. There are good articles not only on the architects we'll be talking about, but also upon individual buildings. So with lots of references. So when you start your exploration of any assignment, often going to Google Scholar to find particular topics in the scholarly literature, and going to Wikipedia to get started on the architecture is probably a good strategy. Anyway, this is the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts at Harvard University. He was designing it, and for some reason he decided that there would be this protrusion for the North Studio. And the issue was that he felt the original design didn't have enough space. He sort of saw so he had this sort of field of repulsion between the ground, the studio coming out. And so in the end, they dug down more to provide a sufficient spatial separation between the ground plane and the studio. And so there's a whole chapter in which he analyzes this sort of dynamics, not in the terms of our frog finding its way to its prey while avoiding a barrier, but just in terms of the architect trying to create an aesthetic balance or a visual balance in the appearance of a building, and using this language of when do two masses attract each other, when do you want to put them close together so that they link, versus when you want to separate them, and then what is the right separation that looks right. You can do this for yourself just by taking any picture you like And you can do this either on the computer or physically, but just placing it on a blank page and moving it. And then ask yourself, why the hell did I put it there? Why was that? Why was that? Was it that I was going for symmetry, or that in fact the lack of symmetry appealed to me? A lot of us will go for left-right symmetry, but more space underneath than above the picture. Maybe you change the picture size if you were doing it on the computer and so on. So that's just a way of getting a sense of these dynamic fields. So I'm not going to develop that theme, but I think it's interesting to me, this transition, which of course Arnheim didn't know about, of seeing this way in which competition and cooperation, attraction and repulsion and so on, gives us a very general framework on which this might be, if you will, the aesthetic endpoint. So I think there's a real topic to explore there. So if you choose that building, you could explore that as your part of your thing. Okay, so the last, we have very many slides, but we have a lot of time together. Yes, question?
What was the name of the book again?
Yes. The Dynamics of Architectural Form, and as I say, the noted art critic who wrote it is Rudolf Arnheim. Any other questions at this point before I go to the next sub-theme? Okay, so I talked about the notion of schema, and I mentioned that it's perhaps best known in the world of psychology for the book by Frederick Bartlett on remembering. But in fact, he was inspired by the work of two neurologists named Head and Holmes. And Head is one of those people who rejoices in having a name that fits with his profession. He was a neurologist. For many years, the standard textbook in neurology was by Lord Brain, Russell Brain. That's my favorite example of this, and you can probably add others of your own, is that the guy who first ran the 4-minute mile was Roger Bannister, but his partner, the guy who paced him for that, was named Chataway, and so he eventually became a member of Parliament. But what did Head and Holmes do back in 1911? They discovered that if people had damage to the parietal lobe of the brain on one side, they could lose their appreciation of their body. So a person with this hemispatial neglect could neglect this half of the body, so that if they were getting dressed, they would put this arm in the sleeve, they wouldn't put this arm in the sleeve. And it got even more bizarre, so that if the nurse said to the patient, Mr. Smith, why didn't you put your shirt on this arm? So, oh, I don't know what that arm is. Maybe the surgeon put it there as a joke. And this is what I meant earlier by saying how neuroscience, I think, can change our view of phenomenology. At times we think, oh, this is the way I experience, this is the way it is, and yet we discover these brain lesions, or the work we get by analyzing brain activity through brain imaging in humans or through electrodes in certain animals, we begin to see that all these different processes are involved. And so the thought is that maybe in future architects, by knowing there are these different processes involved, can learn how to better tap them to create desired effects. That's something that you might be able to come back to. So the strange phenomenon of neglect of half of the body was what started them off, and so this led them to define the notion of a body schema. This is knowing where your body is. Anything which participates in the conscious movement of our bodies is added to the model of ourselves and becomes part of those schemata, schemas. A woman's power of localization may extend to the feather on her hat. So this is obviously a different age in which ladies that neurologists knew wore very fancy hats with feathers on them. But our modern example is if you're driving your car, while you're acting as driver, your body is that of the car. It's not that as you drive through a narrow space, you can do it safely because you temporarily have that body schema that is the width and length of the car. So, using that example of driving a car or using a tool or wearing a hat, the body schema changes with one's circumstances. Perhaps you've had the experience that if you're wearing a hat, probably not with a feather on, and you come to a doorway that's low, you may duck your head unconsciously to go through the doorway, even though without the hat you would not have ducked your head because you've adjusted the body schema. So, an interesting thing is how do hand and symbol shape body schemas? What's the difference between individuals, occupations, and societies? So this is something I'm not going to get into too much in these lectures, but some of my colleagues in NfA, the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, are very concerned with, well, what happens when you design a building for people who are very different? Okay, which can be good or bad. So very different could mean they're kids, young kids, infants, so they're small, so you're designing to their body scale, but they're also at a very limited but highly adaptive learning stage of knowledge. So how do you build an environment for them? That's different from an environment for college kids, and that's different for a factory, and that's different for a home for people with Alzheimer's, where you can't rely on memory of the environment. So what do you do to help them with that? So that notion of how you relate your body to the environment and how you can adapt to changes in your body as well as changes in the environment is an important topic. So this is just to make the point that changing affordances and effectivities, if you use a tool, then you make a transition from the tool as the object to be picked up. Your body ends here at your hand, but once it's in your grasp, your body ends here at the end of the screwdriver. And then we can get into interesting things about how you shape your hand to both hold the screwdriver firmly and to steer it. But that's not part of our discussion here. So the end, here's the jargon, the end effector migrates distally from the hand, yet it's still the hand that has to be controlled. So in terms of my brain research, I'm very interested in those transformations. In terms of our discussion in this course, the issue is just simply that different people will have different body schemas. How does the building accommodate those differences? I think I've said enough of this. The body schema is not a fixed entity. It changes with circumstances. This is just illustrating this notion of unilateral neglect of space. This is actually, again, I don't know whether we're going to plug this into our work in architecture, but it's actually an amazing thing. And it goes into that notion that the brain is a house of many mansions, if you like. So we already talked about hemi-neglect in terms of action. You neglect half your body. So in terms of your own body schema, there's this. Now what Bizziac and Nuzzati in Milano did was not to look at neglect of the body, but in the environment. And what is even stranger is they did a memory task. So what they did was they said to these people in Milan who were familiar with the cathedral, Il Duomo, and said, okay, describe for me, imagine that you're standing in the Piazza Il Duomo and you're looking at the Duomo. Tell me what you see. And then they'll describe in considerable detail what the right hand of the Duomo looks like. They'll probably tell you about the buildings going all the way around the square on the right-hand side. Okay. Now here's the bizarre thing. You say to them, okay, now imagine yourself walking over to the Duomo and then turn right around and tell me what you see. And now they describe in great detail the other side. So the whole square is there in their memory. But because of the hemi-neglect, they can only achieve recollection of the half of it that's related to their current perspective. Totally bizarre. But very interesting. And here are just some of the brain areas where damage can cause this neglect. But so I guess in terms of talking to architects, there are two strategies, I think. One is, okay, here are some fascinating things about the brain, and it enriches our understanding of how people experience buildings to know that brains are like this. And then the other half is perhaps going to be a little more applied. Well, if I'm designing for kids, if I'm designing for college students, if I'm designing for Alzheimer's patients and so on, what can you tell me about them that I need to know? And I think a real question for that is the issue of who has to know what. We each have a limited domain of knowledge. An important, if we go back to that earlier example of the fovea, right? Our fovea is at any time telling us about a very small part of the visual world, and our periphery is giving us a sketch. But that external sketch allows us to shift attention to other parts where the fovea can now fill us in. So in some sense, our knowledge of the world is like that. Each of us has experience that makes us richly knowledgeable in some aspects of both our personal world and general knowledge. So, but we need, if you will, a periphery which allows us to know enough to talk to other people, and then in some sense they can be our foveas for things that are not part of our own phobia. So in a sense, then the issue is if we're talking to an architect, it may be that the basic neuroscience research is here, the cognitive science research is the bridge, saying, okay, I've got a deeper understanding of what's going on in cognition, action, perception, and that's what I have to tell the architect about, and he has to report back from what he sees people doing, and then that can allow me to formulate new hypotheses that can then go back to the neuroscientists who will do the new experiments. And so it's that relation of multiple experts in a network that is the knowledge network that we have to grow. And as I said much earlier, it's early days yet, so how successful that's going to be, I don't know. What I can tell you is that architects really are intrigued by the brain, they're learning more about it, and I think what I see as our responsibility is to be able to tell them more and more that is at least very interesting and hopefully some of it very relevant. Okay. So to conclude this bit on the body schema, and then I'm going to do a case study of libraries as the last part of today's very long lecture, because I emphasize that normally we're going to have the off-camera student presentations for the first half and then the lecture for just the second half, whereas today, for good or bad, you get me for the whole time. Okay, so out from the body and in from the building. This is just a very short headline, but I really think there's something deep there for us to pursue and understand better. So a carpenter doesn't use a single tool. So part of the thing we're trying to grow within the neuroscience community is that understanding of the plasticity of the body schema, as I go from the hand being my end effector as I grasp the tool, in this case a pen, and then the tip of the pen being my end effector as I write. And then, but what is interesting is nonetheless I'm still using the motor system for arm and hand that was there all along, but now I'm giving it a new effectivity, namely to control the end here. And the affordances I'm getting back, the pressure on the paper and so on, are now, I'm not getting the pressure if I touch on the paper, I'm getting this indirect by the pressure is transduced from the tip of the pen to my hand, but now I can tell if my hand has slipped, as well as the visual feedback of am I keeping on the line if I'm writing on lined paper and so on. So one of the things about us is this notion a carpenter doesn't use a single tool. So I'm doing a job, a little bit of home carpentry. I put down the screwdriver, I pick up the pliers, and fiddle with that for a while, and then I put that down, I get a nail, and I get a hammer. Now this is even more complicated because my hand is no longer the end effector, and the end of the hammer is no longer the end effector, it's the tip of the nail. And yet I have the skill, actually not very good at it, usually the nail gets bent, but to drive that nail accurately into the intended place. So this is a very interesting area of active research in neuroscience. What I'm suggesting is that maybe the complementary thing is that sort of moving out. If we think of the building as a set of tools for living, it's sort of an inside-out robot, that we learn to use a room, we learn to use a building by adjusting our body schema, not to the tool in our hand, but to the tool that is the changing interface with the building. And so understanding that, I think, is going to be what's the body schema of the building, if you like, how does the building change our body schema, and this notion that we'll come back to when we talk about mirror neurons in some weeks from now, is the idea that we evolved not for physical interaction alone, but for social interaction. I mean, the social interaction includes physical interaction and symbolic interaction, emotional interaction. But that idea of that in some sense we're exploiting our natural interactions, both physical and social, and when we build a building and when we experience a building, we're tapping into all of those. We're tapping into our ability to physically interact, but also emotionally. That notion of atmosphere we'll be getting back to in, I think, week 4 or 5. With that, what's the emotional impact of a building? And then the debate I'll be having with some leading scholars on this is that like the impact of other people on us and using those same brain mechanisms, or are we tapping different brain mechanisms for that atmospheric impact? So that'd be an example, I think, of where I don't know whether an architect is going to build a better building when I answer my neuroscience question, but where I have a real neuroscience question. Namely, are the same brain mechanisms involved in what we label empathy with another person versus what some architects label empathy with a building? What sort of emotions are evoked by people? What sort of emotions are evoked by buildings? To what extent are the same mechanisms being exploited? So that's a question we'll be getting back to. Okay, so in the last part of the talk, I want to look at libraries. And the notion is I started this by using an art gallery to get us a sense of how some of these deepest ideas of affordances and effectivities and strategies and scripts and so on could both be brought into play in the design of a building and could also be transgressed in the design of the building. So that was our art gallery example. Now I'm going to use libraries to again look at some of the ideas that we've already discussed, some other ideas, and we'll talk a little bit about wayfinding, and that will take us to the end of today's lecture. So this material is based on a little symposium that was arranged by Eric Tidwell, librarian at Huntington College in Alabama, for the American Libraries Association in 2014. And the 3 people invited in it were Ken Kornberg, who's an architect and also a board member of NfA, Hannah Bennett, who at that time was the architecture librarian at Princeton, and myself. And we were asked to reflect on the impact of neuroscience and architecture. So I'm going to give a slide each to the other speakers, and then I'm going to get into my own things. So this very important slide is from Ken Kornberg, and what he is noting is a sort of matrix, but I've done it as 2 columns rather than rows and columns, but look at all these library functions, the sensory and motor experiences. So you've got a matrix of, what does a library do? Well, it can be a place to contemplate, for collecting data, it can be a meeting place, you could be presenting things, reading, refuge, storage, studying, teaching. If you talk to people at the library downtown, one of the main functions seems to be a place for the homeless to find some respite from the streets. That, on the other hand, experience in architecture, you can invoke all the senses: vision, shape, color, order, smell, taste, even coffee at least, sound, touch, pressure, temperature, and then the motion, and maybe even pain. So, but what he's doing here is he's giving us a sense of the embodied user, not just the pure functionality of the building. So you're really invited to say, well, what are the different functionalities, and what is the impact upon the person in the building? And again, in talking to architects, I have to point out that a neuroscientist, a real neuroscientist, as it were, is not going to be an expert on all these things. Somebody who devotes their life to vision may devote their life to the early stages of visual cortex in monkeys, and that's end of the story. So again, the issue is how do we form the appropriate partnerships? So it's a bit like if you're if an architect is working on a building, he or she will in fact have many different people on the team. I was talking to an architect in Chicago, and there's a new specialization now called elevatoring. And the idea is this: you design a 70-story building, and people want to get from one floor to another very quickly. But if every elevator stopped at every floor, then almost all the floor space would be taken up by the elevators if you're going to get up to the 70th floor. So it turns out to be a whole specialization now within architecture. That idea that often when I talk to architects, it's as if they think neuroscientists know all of neuroscience. A few years back, I made a taxonomy of the papers at the Neuroscience conference, and I came up with a hierarchy with 438 subsets. So a person who knows all about molecules in the synapse will know nothing about affordances and effectivities. And so again, we have that network of knowledge, and how do we find the people we need when we need them? So anyway, that's his point, just to give us some thought of, when you think about a building, realize how many different parts of your sensory system, your motor system, your associative system, your memory system, and so on, are engaged by that. So that's that part. And the other part from Hannah Bennett, again, I'm using one slide just to extract what were long and interesting talks, but here she's giving us the Stockholm Library designed by Erik Gunnar Asplund, one of the great Swedish architects. And what she's asking us to look here is not so much the issue of functionality, but as it were the symbolic value. The idea this is a place of learning, so to get there, okay, there's a place you can tie your bicycle, but that's not the important one. The point is you're ascending to this home of knowledge. And then even when you get into this dramatic entrance, so notice the contrast with Lina Bo-Bardi's art gallery, where the entrance was nondescript. Head up the stairs, catch the elevator. It really is the idea. Here's a magnificent entrance, and you come through there, and then here's a stairway. You haven't even got there yet, but you're ascending to the palace of knowledge. And then you've got here this display of the books, so you get this real sense of the knowledge. You are coming to a place where knowledge is laid out before you. So I think this ties in with this notion of atmosphere that we discussed before. There's, on the one hand, what are the details that will guide your detailed interactions, but there's what is the impact. So this is a somewhat awesome response to, and if you'll forgive me another aside, when King James first saw St. Paul's Cathedral in London, he said, "This is an awful artificial building." But that was high praise, because by awful, he meant what we would now mean by awe-inspiring. And by artificial, he meant that it was a masterpiece of artifice of the architect's work. So,
I have a
yeah,
question. Do you think people learn better or faster or easier in that kind of building versus maybe Geisel or just, a run-of-the-mill library in the neighborhood?
Well, this is something that librarians discuss. I mean, this is clearly a national statement. This is the library in the capital city. But I think the idea of, if you go around the public library in downtown San Diego, to my mind, is a pastiche. It isn't a unified building. It's a collection of pieces. It's by a local architect. It's not a masterpiece. But what's interesting is that different parts have a very different feel. So there's a children's area where everything's in terms of the books are on display. They have colorful covers. There are tables where you can play with things as well as look at the books. There are other places that are set up with, there's a genealogy section where all the tools you need are around, and everybody's very seriously finding what they need. So I don't know how much this level matters, but the idea that setting a tone, is this a place where you're going to chat? Before I went to this meeting, I had a meeting with a number of people in the library at USC, my previous institution, University of Southern California. And they were talking about that issue of how do you set up places for a person to really concentrate on their own work versus how do you set up places where people can use the library's resources while working together on a project. So this symbolic value, yeah, if you're into that sort of thing, probably just by entering that, I mean, I certainly know as an undergraduate that there was a library in Sydney, the Mitchell Library. Have you been there?
I guess so, yeah.
Anyway, and you walk in, and it's this great room with, it's rectangular rather than circular, but you've got these tiers of books and the various balconies you can go to, and to go up there and walk along, and you really feel there's so much to know, and that instills a very different thing from the so much to know when you surf the web. Now, another library that Hannah mentioned, which I just visited in Berlin a few months ago, was designed by Norman Foster, and it was explicitly designed to look like a brain. But it's a very interesting building. But what was poignant about the visit was that they had a little tape recorder that I could carry around to get narration as I went to different parts of the building. And the last part was the narration by the architect about how he went about designing it, Norman Foster. And he started with the act of reading a book. And imagine yourself sitting under a tree reading a book. And that was his shaping image from which he went on to think about designing the library. And the irony, of course, was that as I walked around, maybe 1 person in 10 had a book. Everybody else had a computer. And so there's a real discussion with the librarians. What do you do in the age of the computer when yes, books still have a role, but it's become much less important. And Ken Kornberg, who I mentioned earlier, does a lot of design for research institutes. But one of his secondary roles is redesigning libraries. You go in, you've got a good library, but it's book-centered. How do you make it so the books still have a role, but the computer is king? So, all right. So I'm going to look at 2 libraries in our time together before we finish today. The first is the University Library at Southern California, University of Southern California, Doheny Memorial Library, and I'm going to use some slides given to me by Ruth Wallach, who was one of the library people I talked to at USC when I was getting ready for the meeting. And then I'm going to close with a very brief look at the Seattle Public Library, designed by Rem Koolhaas, one of today's star architects, and relate it to the theme of wayfinding, and then that will be enough. So here, on a more modest scale, we get that idea of by raising the thing, you're approaching the temple of knowledge, as it were. And then you go through the doors, and once again, you've got more steps that carry you up to the main lobby. And then, as Ruth says, you are now in the Great Hall, symbolic of the realm of wisdom and truth. So that idea that whether you look at it in the more practical terms we discussed of what is the environment for kids to enjoy exploring knowledge, or for a serious scholar to enjoy exploring knowledge, the idea of that symbolism of the realm of wisdom and truth is an interesting idea that one might factor into that sort of building. But now, Ruth is distressed, but then an unprepossessing entryway, if we just go back, this doorway off at the side is how you get into the stacks, and you enter through there, and now you have this, an unprepossessing entryway, a narrow door into a compressed space, then the stacks. One feels like an animal burrowing underground, no natural light, compressed space, low ceilings. She doesn't like it. Now, actually, in defense of the architect for this building, the building was commissioned at a time when the stacks were closed. So It was purely, as the word stacks implies, sort of a place you stacked the books so they could be retrieved when a reader wanted them. It wasn't a place where the general public went in. So that's interesting. The idea of, okay, here is, if you will, pure functionality without aesthetics. And here is a particular person, Ruth Wallach, a librarian, in fact the architecture librarian at the time we interacted, saying, I don't like it. But my son was an undergraduate and is now an architect in Austin, Texas, and he had a very different view of the Doheny stacks. Low ceiling, isolated desks in nooks and crannies, the drum of the air conditioning, being lost and finding unexpected books as you scan the stacks. So this is this notion of wayfinding that we'll talk about briefly in a moment, of how do you find your way to a particular place, is a big theme in architectural practice, and people relate it to the role of the hippocampus, the brain region that's linked to spatial maps, and we'll talk about that very briefly. Again, one lecture, two lecture, but we won't do it. But the other thing is getting lost. Is actually when you can't find your way. I don't know about you. Have you been to Venice? Okay, well the great thing about Venice is you get lost, because it's not just streets, there are canals. And so what happens is you're going down a street and you want to get to the other side of the canal, and you come there and a bridge. You look up there, there's a bridge. So you go back and you wander around the alleys, and then you come out and there's the bridge. And if you're not in a hurry to get anywhere, just makes it an absolute delight to explore the city in this totally random way. So that's another interesting thing. If you're designing a building, on the one hand, you would want to do the wayfinding. If people have to get somewhere, if I'm designing a hospital, I need to get to emergency or to the X-ray, I'd better have signs, maybe colored lines on the floor or whatever, that are going to allow people to get very quickly where they want to go. But if I'm building an art gallery, Lena Bobardi again, maybe I don't want to make it too orderly. Yeah, maybe if they need to get to the European collection or the Far East Asian collection, okay, give them a general hint. But maybe you want that to be more a place you wander through and make unexpected discoveries, rather than a place where you just go to see the Mona Lisa and you don't care about the rest of the art. So that's the sort of contrast there. So this is just to sort of remind us of that notion of affordances as invitations to action. And so here we see we can both perceive things about the scene sort of contemplatively, but we can also find affordances for our navigation, and those affordances can be conscious and unconscious. Here we have an affordance that says this is the way to come in, and it's announcing it, I'm a special place. This is not just any affordance. You're very lucky if you can use this affordance. And then we have this notion. And what I think might be worth stressing is this complementarity between having a map and just navigating without a map. I look for something, I explore, I see something, I guide myself towards it. So you can be in a strange town, you want to go out to dinner. One way to do it is to ask the concierge to give you a map, and then you follow the map to get to the restaurant he recommends. The other is to get a general indication, the restaurant area is that way, and then you just explore. And then the streets give you affordances for moving in that right direction, and then the signs give you affordances for this is a classy joint, this is a hamburger place, and so on and so on. So this complementarity between affordances are what does your immediate environment tell you can do, and a map giving you access, whether it's an explicit map on paper or a quotes map encoded in your head, giving you access to a realm of knowledge beyond the immediate environment that can nonetheless let you find your way to some goal. Or, as we say, you can just get lost and explore. So, the classic story is this, that John O'Keefe, I already mentioned, for his Nobel Prize for this work, discovered what are called place cells in the hippocampus of the rat. So the basic idea was this, that there were places in the hippocampus. This is a drawing by Ramon Cajal, who flourished around 1900. Perhaps the greatest Spanish scientist of all time, but anyway, certainly the greatest neuroanatomist. And so there's the anatomy. If you will, this is a cross-section. The hippocampus runs like this. So this is looking at it in sideways. And if you're fanciful, because it sort of looks like a seahorse, and Latin and Spanish and so on, hippocampus is, or hippocampo is the word for seahorse. So that's where it got its name from. Anyway, what this is, a rat running around a square room, and this delicate tracer is just its path over a certain period of time, and the red dots are where a particular cell fired. And the point is that the cell fired for this region, and so it was the place the rat was in was the salient cue for that. And of course, one cell doesn't tell you all that much, but another key notion from neuroscience is that is a population code. You never rely on one cell. You have a bunch of cells that between them tell you. So that if you had here, there would be cells from here and cells from here and cells from here firing. And so the fact that you could get that group of cells would say, well, you must be in this small region if this distribution of cells could fire, and your brain knows how to interpret that. Okay, so that was place cells in the hippocampus. He shared the Nobel Prize a couple of years back with a husband and wife couple who followed up on this work, the Moses from Norway, who went back one level to look at the entorhinal cortex, a region that feeds into the hippocampus, and they showed something called grid cells that were setting up information that then the place cells could exploit. And something I'll talk about next time in a little more detail is that often as neuroscientists we will focus on one region of the brain and see what the cells are doing there or what the brain imaging is doing there. But it's always the case that that part of the brain is receiving input from other parts of the brain, is sending input to yet other parts of the brain. There are return pathways. So whenever we see what's going on here, we're really sampling a larger system. And so depending on what we're doing, we may either just focus on and say, okay, this system is giving us the crucial information we need for navigation by telling us where we are. Or you can say, yeah, it's telling you, there's a classic cartoon where a guy is in the middle of a desert and he sees a signpost and it turns out to be a map. But all that's on the map is an X saying you are here. And the point is that a map is no good unless it doesn't only tell you are here, but lets you find where you want to be, and then lets you find from that knowledge a path that will get you from A to B. So again, in some other modeling my group's done, we've looked at embedding the hippocampus in a much larger brain system to, on the one hand, navigate by affordances, and on the other hand, navigate by a real cognitive map of where you want to be. Now, intriguingly, whereas in the rat, a lot of the focus has been on this where are you function, the place cells, the most famous data point about the human hippocampus comes from this man, H.M. And many papers were written on him, but his privacy was protected during his lifetime, and it was only when he died a few years back that we were told he was Henry Gustav Mollison. And what happened was he, as a young man, had massive epilepsy. And so these huge storms would keep raging through his brain, and in the end his surgeon probably went overboard, and instead of saying, can I make a small cut and see if it solves the problem, he just pulled out this huge region which included the hippocampus, but also a lot of the temporal lobe around it. And the sad thing was that he lost episodic memory. He couldn't make new memories of episodes. So I had one colleague who went to do a study with him, and it was back in the old days when you didn't have your own personal phone. So he was talking to HM, and he was called out of the room to take a phone call. And when he came back, he apologized to HM, but HM had no memory that he'd met this guy. But if you were engaged in the conversation, his working memory seemed to be working. So you could keep the conversation going, but once you left, that working memory was no longer relevant. It was thrown away, and then when you came back, there was no episodic, no memory of that earlier episode. On the other hand, he could form new procedural memories. So the classic one was you could introduce him to a game and play with him, and he'd pick up something that would seem, and then you'd go away, and then you'd come back the next day with the same game, and he had no memory of playing it before. But over the days, even though he never remembered having played it before, he became more and more skillful. So again, this was learning something important about the brain, that there are different memory systems, in this case a procedural memory system, learning new skills, and an episodic memory, remembering particular episodes. And did either of you see Memento? Okay, so that was based on HM, but turning it into a real drama where our hero could develop a new procedure, which was to take pictures of past events, well, of present events, so he could consult them later, and to have himself tattooed with aphorisms that were useful. And of course, the dramatic turn of the movie was that we were placed in the same position of having no memory, because the episodes were played backwards, so we never knew what had happened before the present episode in the movie. And so in the end, we saw that that particular memory system he had devised was very unreliable and very distorted. But for anybody out there in Videoland who hasn't seen this, then I recommend that as your homework for these few slides, is to look at that and just think about what that means about the strange nature of the human brain when it's disrupted. Okay, so I promised one more piece of architecture. This is Rem Koolhaas, a Dutch architect. Very controversial. Some people love his work, some people hate it, but that might make this library a very good subject for a term project. So he said a very strange thing. This is the public library in Seattle. He said the architects let the building's required functions dictate what it should look like. And I find that very unconvincing. But anyway, the basic idea was to separate the functions like this: parking, staff functions, meeting rooms, the spiral, the headquarters. Now the spiral, instead of having, this is an interesting concept, instead of having the different floors with different subjects, the books were just arranged in a continuous spiral, so you'd walk down 4 floors. And this got a real problem with 4 stories on a continuous series of shelves with no stairs. So, as you can see, the external form is very much not dictated by the function, except you're saying I'm going to have these pieces, and now I'm going to move them back and forth to come up with the external shape that I like. But never mind. This was the real controversy, because it's a bit like the wayfinding versus way showing. If you just want to find your own way, the idea of, well, get into the spiral and, about halfway down you might find the book you're looking for, could be sort of fun if you want to make those discoveries of things nearby. On the other hand, if you really want to get a book soon, then go to the 3rd level, turn left, and go through the 3rd row, and you'll find the book you want is much more attractive. So that was the sort of debate about that. And an international team divided between the US and Germany, and I think even England, came up with a book called Getting Lost in Buildings, which used the Seattle Public Library as one of their examples. But they were more generally looking at the layout of what are the cues that allow people to orient themselves. So people often get lost in buildings. So what can you do with the spatial structure of the building? What can you do as the cues that let people build their cognitive maps? So as you get into the building, maybe the first time you're going to get lost anyway, but you can remember a few cues. Let's take an example of a standard cue for wayfinding in buildings. That is that in most modern buildings of any public use with multiple floors, as distinct from a home, the defining axis is the vertical axis of the elevator shaft. And if you're looking for a restroom, you'll often go first to the vicinity of the elevator. Now, the first strategy will be left for one gender, one right for the other, so that if you find one of the restrooms that's not yours, look on the other side of the elevator as you find it. And that's sort of appealing to you don't need a cognitive, you've got sort of a generic cognitive map you plug in that works for this. In other buildings, you go to the other side, there's none there, and it's alternate floors. And then in the next door building here at UCSD, it's the opposite ends of the floor. So you have to go all the way from one end if you discover you're at the male end to get to the female end. But the point is that this sort of general strategy is very quickly linked to the particular building, so that thereafter you've got that little fragment of a map that tells you, no matter what floor you're on, how to satisfy that particular basic need. So this idea of what cues do you get to give people that as they navigate, they're building at least a partial cognitive map of what it is they're looking for. And then this scheme, which I'm not going to go into in detail, is just the way in which, by defining an axis, you may be able to help people find their way. So here is an axis that goes on forever, so knowing where you are on the axis isn't very helpful. Here's a relatively short axis that with this T-bar here that allows you to perhaps more quickly find your way to a particular part of the building, because if you recognize you're in that central axis, you can use that. I mentioned Ken Kornberg with my first slide about the libraries. When he designs a building, he likes to make the corridors curved, because then you instead of going through an endless corridor, you immediately know that the inside versus the outside, so you know which direction you're going, depending on whether the inside is on your left or your right, and you also only have half the rooms to look at. They're on no matter which way you're going, the inside is defined, the outside is defined. So those are some of the issues in bridging from the basic discovery of place cells into the issue of wayfinding and the design of buildings. Next time I want to come back and look at the episodic memory function, and in particular I'm going to be looking at the relation of memory to imagination. So that is, when you imagine something, well, you can't be remembering it, but it's going to depend upon your experience. That issue of how can the brain find the right fragments of your previous experience to construct a new totality that is the imagination. And that's why I went through in a little bit of detail that's computer system for visual recognition that I claimed was in the style of the brain, using schemas, so you could see how different local cues could there elicit different parts of the scene, and then patterns of competition and cooperation could determine, unless it was a Magritte painting, a global coherence that would recognize the overall thing. So in some sense, when you are in recognition, you're constructing something in terms of do the pieces fit together with what you're looking at. In imagination, though, do the pieces fit together in terms of some ad hoc criterion that's guiding your imagination. In memory, sometimes it comes back to you in a flash, but usually then you have to think more carefully. And as we know, people often misremember, they confabulate, they pull in pieces that shouldn't have been there, but that seem at the time plausible. Okay, so this is just to remind the members of the class about assignment 1, that to find a building you like, and just try to begin to think about how the concepts we've discussed today relate to your experience of the building, and try and find some literature about the brain that you think might be relevant to that sort of conversation that we've been initiating today. And then here again are the topics, which may change, but at least we're fixed that. Next week I'll be talking about towards a cognitive neuroscience of architectural design. I'll be off to Chile in week 3, but I'll be back to talk about atmosphere as another kind of affordance, and our slogan, as we said, will be sort of Gibson's affordances are for motion. Affordance is in the sense of atmosphere as affordance for emotion. That's it. Thank you.